Hello folks, Severin here. In this video, we'd like to dig into what scientific illuminism is all about and why you should care about it. So, scientific illuminism is a term that describes the practice of applying a slightly modified version of the scientific method to contexts other than just the purely physical world. The term was first popularized back in 1913 in an anthology of occult philosophy known as the Equinox, for those of you who care. It came with the subtitle, The Review of Scientific Illuminism. For this reason, you'll occasionally hear me making references to occult philosophy. But don't worry, I'm not going to get all woo-woo on you. On this channel, we'll stick to what we can ascertain rationally and apply to our daily lives. There won't be any magic missiles or any of that sort of nonsense. Quite the contrary. Scientific Illuminism is strictly concerned with gaining a better understanding of the tangible world you and I are currently immersed in, not in trying to distance ourselves from it in fantasy. Having a clear picture of how the world really works is essential for achieving long-term success in any endeavor. The big difference between scientific illuminism and the classic scientific method really boils down to what constitutes evidence. See, in mainstream science, all evidence is gathered using objective means. Sometimes that's through simple observation, but more commonly it's through the output of some kind of instrumentation. When dealing with faculties of the mind, we don't have the benefit of very much instrumentation. That being said, I should point out that there are several promising initiatives within the field of biofeedback that allow us to provide some tangible results that any scientist would have to respect, but those devices are still very limited. For the most part, we're forced to accept subjective experience as evidence. That being the case, we must always be mindful of how unreliable subjective experience can be. So to offset that risk, to a reasonable degree, we can't forget the importance of the last step of the scientific method. And I'll give you a hint. It's the same as on your shampoo bottle. Repeat. By confirming a subjective experience with another person, conducting the same blind experiment, blind meaning that they don't know anything about the previous result, we can confirm that the method or idea being tested has certain properties in consensus reality. But that doesn't mean that a particular method or practice will work for everyone. It may turn out that there are some preconditions that must be met before it works, but those things are only revealed over time and through many, many repetitions of the scientific illuminism method. So the term consensus reality refers to the reality that we all experience and agree is real, at least real enough relative to us, as opposed to simply being something that exists within our individual imaginations. The word consensus is included to highlight the fact that we're including shared subjective experience in addition to purely objective experience in our definition of what comprises reality. Note that you may also hear me talk about consensus universe. The consensus universe, which stands in contrast to the personal universe, is a model that depicts things we know to be true about consensus reality. So we have the thing and the model, map the terrain. The personal universe is the same concept, but is based entirely on the knowledge and experience of the individual. So there you have it, your first foray into the wonderfully confusing world of domain-specific languages. We're going to have plenty more, I have no doubt, but I will try to make it easier by including definitions of certain words which may be used in unexpected ways, so I don't unintentionally lose anyone or confuse you along the way. So let's wrap this section up with a concrete example. This is all likely to become too abstract to be really helpful. Let's say we want to determine whether astral projection is real or not. So then step one, the scientific method tells us to formulate a hypothesis. In this case, it's quite obvious. As a general rule, we'll always assert the positive. So our hypothesis is astral projection is real and works via the following method. And we insert whatever chosen method we want from whatever book. Step two. Next, we must define what the success criteria is. This has a description of a subjective experience which, if experienced by more than one person, will offer strong evidence that this method describes a real thing that exists in reality. Doesn't prove it, doesn't anything of that sort, but it does strongly suggest that it's certainly worthy of further study. The third, and really, step 3 is going to be more kind of a note or a guideline more than it is a particular concrete step, because it has to do with getting to the conclusion and getting to an understanding of what it is that we're actually seeing, feeling, or experiencing. And the thing is, you don't always get that in science, and you often won't get it here either. What we get is a collection of evidence based on the properties of a thing, and we can kind of reverse engineer from there. But that doesn't really tell us what the thing is. It just gives us an idea. We could extrapolate from the effect that it has, what kinds of properties it has, and therefore what kind of a structure it may be. But here's an example from modern science, for example, that gives you a sense of why that doesn't necessarily prove that a thing is X just because it walks like a X and quacks like X. I mean, so imagine the particle model of the atomic structure. Don't lose me here. I'm just mean the standard model that you've seen a million times before in science classrooms across the world, where you've got the protons and the neutrons and that are bound together in the nucleus, and then you have this orbiting lattice work of electrons around it. But that, for example, is just a model. It's a model that is very accurate in the sense that it does a very good job of describing the behavior and the effect of the existence of an atom in a particular location. And it could even predict behavior of an atom. If XYZ were to happen to it, how would it respond? That model does a great job of that, but it has its limits. The model is only true within certain parameters. If we get into a different set of preconditions, such as the double slit experiment. So the double slit experiment is one where they're watching waves that are going through two slits, and the details of that aren't important, but the point is that the particle model of atomic structure does not hold. It doesn't provide any value. It's not that it's necessarily disproven, that's not what I'm saying, but it just isn't applicable to that problem set, into the set of circumstances. So what does mainstream science do? Well, they just throw the atomic structure of the atom out the window and adopt an entirely different model, which that's entirely within their purview to do, entirely within ours to do as well. So they adopt a wave model where they describe the atom in terms of electromagnetic waveforms, because that then does describe the observable phenomenon of that particular experiment. So this isn't a controversial thing. Mainstream scientists understand this, that models are not the thing, and kind of like the old adage of don't confuse the map for the terrain, and that's very much the case. So as we think about that, and as we think about the way that we may not ever know the true truth of what a thing really is, and think about if bringing it more into the scientific Illuminism domain, if we think about ghosts or something like that, what is a ghost? There will be answers to that question, but those answers will be driven by a particular model. And so we could only say, if for a person who subscribes to the XYZ model, then for them a ghost would be defined this way. But for somebody that is based in a different model, then their definition could vary. And this explains to you right now all of the Usenet groups, through the mailing groups, through the Facebook groups, and everything that have been dealing with these subjects for decades, and why they're just constantly embroiled in never-ending arguments, because it's almost like speaking different languages. If you're not coming at the subject from the same model, then you're not going to agree on what the definitions are. And you can sit there and fight and squawk back and forth with each other online, but no one's going to ever agree or come to an understanding because you're both telling the truth. You're both telling your own truth from your own perspectives. And until you get to a point where you can document your model and say, this is the model I'm using, here are the properties of it, and here's how it's how that model is internally constructed. Because even though the thing may not be able to be very clearly defined or completely defined, your model can. Your model can be written down. Your model can be communicated to another human being. So when you get to that point that you're able to do that, then that would be the only way, really, of coming to any kind of conclusion on most of these types of things that occur online, with people are just speaking different languages in a sense, but also not at the same time. But that's the missing piece that can bridge that gap. So that's point number 3. So point number 3 was just a point about models, a point about understanding what truth is, what things really are, versus a model of what they seem to be or what they appear to be. So let's move on to number 4. The number 4 in the list is so we can now begin planning for at least 2 repetitions of the experiment. And now, naturally, the more repetitions, the better, but we're often constrained by numbers of volunteers. If possible, it's best to run them all at the same time. So we find a few volunteers and provide them with the method described in the hypothesis, along with a time constraint. Then we move on to number 5. So number 4 is just getting our experiment ready, getting and kind of running ahead a little bit and getting prepared for multiple iterations of the experiment. Then number 5 is so the time constraint. So making sure that we're actually going to be able to, that this experiment is going to end in some reasonable time. It's not going to just drag on and on and on for months and years and forever. So it has to end in a reasonable time frame. But it can be difficult to determine what that time frame is in many cases. So it may be necessary to run some preliminary analysis, either by doing some personal experimentation or by seeking the advice of others who claim to have some success in this area, to see how long it took them, and maybe use that as a guide. So for the sake of argument, we'll just say in this example that it's 2 weeks. That's for the astral projection example that we're talking about. Step 6 is the final step in our preparations to define the success criteria for the experiment. Similarly to how the hypothesis is generally a pretty obvious restating of the original question, the success criteria is often provided within the final step of the method. In this case, it's a detailed description of what we'd expect the astral world to be like based on accounts, for first-hand witness accounts from people who claim to have successfully traveled there. And so this could potentially validate a couple of things right on either side of the map, because if we are able to use this structured method to be able to confirm that yes, we can reproduce these same experiences, it also has a secondary effect of validating those people that we gathered those the depictions of those experiences from. Step 7. So then we run the experiment and check in after 2 weeks. In this case, the experimenters had work to do each day and wrote their subjective experiences in a journal that they updated after each attempt at the method. By comparing the journals, each containing 14 successive attempts to successfully perform the method, we can determine whether any interesting patterns are emerging. Even if none of the experimenters achieved the full success criteria, a consistent pattern of progress may be enough to warrant further experiments. And maybe we need more time, for example. But conversely, if no 2 experimenters achieved any results, or they were widely divergent results, we may conclude that the hypothesis is disproven and relegate it to the trash bin. So as you might imagine, this is the result more often than not. But it's all worth it for the cases where things prove to be real, because mind is truly the final frontier. Step 8. At this point, I want to stop and make a comment about the role of belief and faith in all of this. Scientific Illuminism is not a religion, though it often deals with religious matters. So in a way, Scientific Illuminism stands as an alternative to faith, in the same way that science opposes superstition. Thinking back to the example we just walked through, the experimenters were asked to suspend their disbelief long enough to conduct the experiment with an open mind in order to be receptive to the result if it were to occur. But the payoff in the end is that belief will always be dispelled by the conclusion of the experiment. If the experiment succeeds, then belief gives way to knowledge. If the experiment fails, then the corresponding belief is irrational and can be disposed of. So that's it, folks. Scientific Illuminism provides a well-defined and proven method for evaluating all sorts of claims. And at least in most cases, being able to discern fact from fiction and thereby eliminate, to the greatest extent possible, any need for faith. Now please click those like and subscribe buttons. I thought I was going to forget. I'm not forgetting. Need to click the like and subscribe buttons, please. I need to eat, the whole bit. I really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. Bye.